to Laurence, who will be known, I think, to you all, partly because he's the director of the Knapp Foundation. He's also an honorary professor in Lancaster University's Philosophy, Politics and Religion Department and the Management School. And he's published a number of books and translations, including Heidegger's Atheism in 2002, Postmodernity's Transcending in 2005, and in 2013, Heidegger and Marx, A Productive Dialogue over the Language of Humanism. He also edited and co-translated Ernst Junger's 1932 work, Die Arbeiter, The Worker, which was published by Northwestern University Press in 2017. And he's the co-editor of the volume Heidegger and Parmenides, which will be published by Bloomsbury in February, and also currently co-translating Heidegger's undelivered 1942 lectures on Anaximander for polity. And the title of Laurence's paper today, and you see why I talked about the segue, is On Not Being Liberal About Sex. So over to you, Laurence.
John, thank you very much indeed, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present this paper. It provides some of the underlying ideas behind the book that I'm currently working on, and can I just say as well how important I think that these discussions are likely to be in the coming months, and how grateful I am to you for organising these seminars.
It's a great pleasure.
Some years ago, the eminent classical philologist and legal scholar Martha Nussbaum came to speak for the School of Law at Lancaster University on religious freedom. Nussbaum presents a formidable front. She was on the occasion impeccably attired, and with exquisite poise, she argued, and I quote, that the core value in this tradition of religious freedom is that of equal respect for conscience, a value that militates against all governmentally created hierarchies or in-groups. This tradition is on the whole a helpful guide in thinking about other such issues more generally. Nussbaum repeated this argument in a book published shortly after she came to speak, called Liberty of Conscience in Defense of America's Tradition of Religious Equality. What I have quoted suggests that the solution to the problem of religious freedom and liberty of conscience is non-governmental intrusion. But of course, what she made very clear on that occasion is that she meant the entire opposite. Nussbaum cogently argued the liberal position that one may do whatever one wishes, and indeed be whomsoever one wants to be, behind the fences of one's own garden. And it is government, the state, that will enforce that freedom. The state will act as guarantor. This exactly confirms what modern political liberalism is. It is a political theory, not a theory of individualism. It is the means of ordering of the individual's relation to the state. It is unconcerned, I'd like to argue, with freedom as such. Indeed, so uninterested is it in the question of freedom that behind one's fences, one may do practically anything one likes. Freedom has no public use. This is in fact the logic of self-identification. The I, or the self, is bordered in every case by a fence, and you must concede to me whatever it is that I self-identify as behind the fence. This is the final echo of Schelling's understanding of giving the law of freedom to myself. I can decide for myself what sex I am. I may make no such decision for you. You might responsibly advise me of your pronouns. Now, I do not intend today to spend time exploring the absurdities of this position has led to, except to say that many of them are now being decided in the courts. Again, another important segue from David's paper. As Nussbaum herself says, what she argued for is a helpful guide in thinking more generally. What I mean by this is that what she proposes in the arena of religious freedom and freedom of conscience can be and is applied to the so-called sexual revolution. So before we proceed, I'd like to make just one note. In all that follows, I am not going to concern myself with those areas of human sexual life which historically and presently stray into the area of illegality and taboo. My consideration of the sexual revolution in question will explicitly rule out those areas that involve violence or rape or coercive control, and let's leave anything like consensual violence on the margins as well. Nor do I want to dwell on the age of consent for sexual activity, although I note that the British state, and I mean by that the police, are now blurring the lines on that issue. The age of consent to marriage and for sexual activity has varied in the West across the centuries, and has not always been even the same for men and women. Lesbianism, for instance, was never criminalised in England and Wales. The issue here is not so much the age for consent, as that sexual activity outside legal consent, and so which cannot gain any kind of a public face, is often pretext and unpleasantly fertile ground to coercion, exploitation, and worse. Much of what has been gained in law for those at one time outside it has worked to give them the public cover that prevents blackmail, as well as what I have the uglier things that I've already named. So with those caveats made, the liberal position that I want to discuss therefore holds that in matters of personal conscience, including in sexual matters, one may do what one likes provided it is consensual and behind appropriate fences. It places what should at least be capable of a public face firmly behind private doors. Now, I am not and never have been any kind of a liberal. In what follows, I wish, therefore, to take issue with what I define here as liberalism. I do so, however, knowing that the current liberal position on sexual matters is already itself under attack. It is the attack from one quarter, namely a conservative and religious one, that is really my subject today. What prompted me to offer this paper is having read the recent work of yet another legal scholar, Ronan McRae, a professor at UCL, I think, in his recent book, The End of the Gay Rights Revolution. McRae's central contention is that, and I quote, there are more than a few indicators that a backlash against the sexual revolution more generally is imminent and may even be underway. He adds, gay men with their notably libertine sexual culture have placed themselves at the very outer boundary of the freedom won by the broader sexual revolution. If there is any turn in the broader culture against the sexual revolution more generally, and if the boundaries of sexual freedom come under pressure, it is gay freedom that will be one of the first outposts to fall. McRae is not the first person to make this case. Indeed, I hear it being made with increasing frequency. I had a conversation with Kathleen Stock recently, and this is certainly, I don't think it would be wrong to say this is also her view. Over the past 50 or so years, and so within my own lifetime, much has become permissible, which hitherto was at least frowned upon, at worst provoked open hostility, and could at one time, within my own lifetime, in fact, have landed you in prison. It is sometimes difficult to take in how far we have travelled. In my youth, it was acceptable to dismiss someone from securely held employment on the basis that that person was or was reasonably suspected to be homosexual. Now, two people of the same sex may legally marry in a majority of the states of the European Union. I explained to a group of students not long ago that I knew things had really changed in this country when the glass in gay pubs went from frosted to clear. In some pubs, there had been no glass at all. The windows were simply boarded up. One of the students asked me, was this because there was a danger someone might otherwise throw a brick through the window? Now, in fact, until the glass went clear, the people inside gay pubs were in far more danger from were in far more danger from something else than the violence threatened by a mere brick, against which frosted glass is in any case no better protection than clear. The danger was that inside we could be seen. If you were seen, you could be reported to employers or neighbours, friends, or even members of your own family. In the town in which I largely grew up, Portsmouth, young sailors were regularly blackmailed, or if caught, summarily dismissed from the Royal Navy without appeal, because they had been seen going into or coming out of the town's gay pub. And here is the most important point of all. For most people and in most situations, visibility in the social sphere is often experienced as the point at which one becomes, for all practical purposes, invisible, where being seen leads to there being no consequences, evokes no response, no exposure to danger, nor marks you in any way. And I would suggest that this is quite a noble freedom. With our present legal protections and recognition, visible invisibility, if you like, the gay rights revolution has been astonishingly successful. In civil terms, it has achieved almost all, if not in fact all, its aims. And I, for one, have much to be grateful for as a result. McCrae singles out the American conservative critic of liberalism and distinguished legal scholar Patrick Deneen for particular attention in his book. Although I find many of Deneen's arguments compelling, especially much of his critique of liberalism, McCrae identifies Deneen's and others similar to him conservatism as a source of threat to the position in which lesbians and gay men now find ourselves in. This is not to say that there are not other threats as well. For women, lesbians especially, there are, but those are not my concern today. I'm concerned with what concerns conservative thinkers like Deneen at this point in the so-called gay rights revolution. For Deneen and McCrae share much in common in their estimation of where we are. What differs is only really what they think should follow next. Both Deneen and McCrae argue that this sexual revolution is the product of a very specific liberal progressivism. Both argue that this progressivism is in danger of going, or perhaps has already gone, and I quote both of them, too far. McCrae supports, and Deneen is less favourable to where this progress has brought us. My argument, however, is that neither Deneen nor McCrae have really understood what has unfolded in these last 50, or more like 250 years, nor what it means, nor in what it is grounded. Deneen is at his most successful and often most entertaining when attacking the progressivism of John Stuart Mill. Against Mill and what he gives rise to, he argues individualism and statism advance together, always mutually supportive and always at the expense of lived and vital relations. Deneen writes with coruscating disapproval of those liberals and conservatives for whom, and I quote, the state becomes the main driver of individualism, while individualism becomes the main source of expanding power and authority of the state. Now, this is important because Deneen is identifying the relationship of the state and individualism here as a driver of liberalism. But he is not he doesn't identify the state as a particular aspect of the problem. Taking Mill's dictum, and I quote Deneen, that the only purpose for which, this is Deneen quoting Mill, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Deneen argues, and I quote Deneen, Mill's aim was thus to shift from a society thick with social norms and even laws that sought to make men moral, to one in which individuals would be maximally free from the judgment of society altogether. He shows Mill promoting experiments in living, that's a quote from Mill, an aim which also lies at the bottom of much of Michel Foucault's more casual arguments around the sexual revolution. Deneen, as others have done, exposes the partisanship of progressivism. The mass are seen as a brake on this progress. It is only really the enlightened whom we should follow. At least that seems to be Mill's argument. It is worth rehearsing one of Foucault's arguments in this direction. Foucault more than once applauds the fact that homosexuality can be destabilizing for normative sexuality, his words. In a not untypical interview from 1982, we can find him exploring, and I quote, the common fear that gays will develop relationships that are intense and satisfying, even though they do not conform. It is the prospect that gays will create as yet unforeseen kinds of relationship that many people cannot tolerate. Now, Foucault gave a great number of interviews of this kind to small circulation magazines and journals in San Francisco and on the west coast of the United States. Much of it never got back to France. He led, if you like, something of a double life, where he was public about his homosexuality in the United States, but less so in the in France. It is this kind of liberatory gesture, lazily and deliberately imprecisely drawn, that I might suggest often underpins the contemporary forms of the ongoing sexual revolution, and is the impetus for the accusation that it goes too far, made by both Deneen and McCrae. So to return to where we began, it is not difficult to see the extent to which liberalism can also act as a useful brake on this too far. Nussbaum's carefully crafted arguments, her fences if you like, offer to prescribe limits, namely state limits to progress, when it is over hasty or does not allow the recalcitrant time to catch up. It is also not difficult to see why legal judgments and the use of the courts have been so useful here. Law, precedent, and regulation have become central liberal methods for accelerating and decelerating change. Here then is liberalism in its political work. Its announced goals of progress are always guaranteed by the state, the basis for managing the unenlightened mass. Here is the purpose of the fences around the subjectivity of the individual subject. They insulate us from the backwardness of the mass, and they actually effect our pressing towards an open, liberatory future. Certainly McCrae sees it this way. To the goals guaranteed by the progressive state, he gives the name liberal democracy. This is the destiny towards which we should be pressing. This is what has granted us the gay rights revolution. But McCrae bemoans what happens when the liberatory destiny of liberal democracy is threatened. He notes at one point, and I quote, "For example, the European Union required all states that sought to become members to demonstrate that they had embraced liberal democracy. But because no one imagined that liberal democracy once achieved could be reversed, the Union failed to develop effective procedures that could be deployed when states such as Poland and Hungary began to move away from liberal democratic values after joining." Now, I think McCrae is wrong about this. I mean, there is a very plausible argument to suggest that the recent election of Donald Tusk as president in Poland was really only a result of the claim that upwards of 136 billion euro were withheld from the Polish government by the EU Commission. And most of that money has been paid since Tusk's election. So in fact, mechanisms do exist. We can debate that if we wish. But I think McCrae is wrong in suggesting that the EU does not contain mechanisms for getting what it wants. McCrae concedes that progressivism, in its too far, has entered a period of exhaustion. Recognizing its Hegelian roots in his naming of the dissolution of Fukuyama's End of History, he concludes that there really is no necessary or self-evident, and one might therefore say no rational, wrong side of history, to quote him, because, and I quote him again, history does not have a side. And therefore, and I quote him again, the advance of liberal approaches to sex and to homosexuality were not inevitable. He cites Vicente Valentin, when he suggests that at least a part of the progress made among the mass of the population was illusory, since by way of what he calls Valentin calls preference falsification, and I quote Valentin, voters already held reactionary views which they had not acted on because they perceived them to be socially unacceptable. Drawing attention to what McCrae calls the rise of anti-gay populism, he then goes on to accept centuries of hostility do not evaporate in a decade or two. And he concludes some backlash against the sexual revolution shouldn't surprise anyone. Now, McCrae recognizes what in Deneen's work is a powerful motive in the backlash he names. McCrae notes Deneen's sharp criticisms of earlier conservatives. Deneen has Ronald Reagan in his sights especially, and notes that what has passed for conservatism in Deneen's eyes was in fact often a species of liberalism. Once all these forms of progressive liberalism are swept aside, Deneen and his ilk, McCrae argues, and I quote, envisage the state promoting conservative and religious values. Now, there's a great deal more that could be said about Deneen's position, but there are other things I want to say. I'm hoping this audience is well informed enough to fill in the gaps. Any backlash to the essentially liberal and progressive support for a revolution in sexual rights, especially for gay men and lesbians, is indeed likely to come from a conservatism of the form that Deneen exemplifies, the reassertion of a religious, in Deneen's case specifically Christian, disavowal, or at least truncation, of much of the sexual revolution's attainments, and where necessary, a disciplining of sexual freedoms outside a conception of marriage that Deneen certainly understands as restriction to the union of one man and one woman. Above all, Deneen and the tendency that he represents, both in the United States and in Europe, envisage that the rule of law and the powers of the state will become effective enforcers of this religious conservatism. So as we bring this part of my paper to a conclusion, let me say something that I would hope would annoy Deneen no end. He is, in all of this, no less a liberal than McCrae. For just as much as McCrae has pursued a progressivism that envisages the state being the guarantor of the sexual liberation we have witnessed these last 50 or 60 years, so Deneen also envisages the state as bringing it to an end, in exactly the way I have suggested is characteristic of liberalism itself. One might suggest Deneen's fences will be girded with razor wire or electrified, depending on how bad you think it's going to get. Deneen is simply the flip side of progressivism. And here I invoke Nussbaum again, who herself suggested that there needs to be a flip side of progressivism. She is the one who argues that occasionally there has to be a break. And I would suggest, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that Deneen and Nussbaum make strange but rather apt bedfellows. So I hope you will recall my definition of liberalism. Liberalism is formally not an understanding of individual freedom, but an understanding of the individual in relation to the state. To put it another way, I want to defend against liberalism the fundamental principle of common law, which we've just discussed, which has largely undergirded law, at least in this polity, this last millennium or so. And that is that it is essentially permissive, not coercive. It depends on custom, not restriction. The task of law, I would suggest, primarily, is to guarantee freedom and curb harm. It is not to be the agent of moral perfection of either society as a whole or the individual. In this, I argue strongly against both Kant and Hegel and the suggestion that the state has moral entity. A perfective moral role, if it is needed at all, ought ordinarily to be reserved to religion, or ethics, if they attest your God. One important coda. At one point, McCrae argues that there are elements in Deneen's arguments, and I quote him, that overlap to a remarkable degree with that of Islamists such as Sayyid Qutb, a figure inspirational to the foundation of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, does McCrae overstate his case at this point? Well, I think not, for conservative Islam is no more sympathetic to McCrae's gay rights revolution than conservative strains of Christianity. And if the door is open to religious influence over state policy in sexual conduct for one religion, it must be open for any other, with the means and the constituency to represent its case. So much for the political questions that both McCrae and Deneen put before us. For our seminar is a seminar in philosophy, not politics, let alone sociology or anthropology. Just as the very fine and gritty story Brokeback Mountain by Annie Proulx is, I would like to suggest, only superficially a love affair between a tale of a love affair between two cowboys, and is really and more primordially a story about how destiny and the question of the American dream work in the Midwest. So this paper is only tangentially about the question of the gay rights revolution, or any backlash there might be to it, and much more about what is at issue for the polity entire. What we should hear in both McCrae's and Dineen's considerations, and what we should question in them, is a question concerning the ground of the political as such. Most tellingly, McCrae says, and I quote him, "I have often heard someone's anti-gay views described as out of date or old-fashioned, as if gay rights were a form of technology that made homophobia redundant." Now, we have already seen how liberalism's regulative management of progress assumes a technological form. The modern recourse to reducing sexual life to questions of rights and their defense in law and regulation can very well be described as a technology. That is to say, as the way in which social change and a certain kind of societal re-engineering can be carried out. Foucault spent a great deal of time explaining this, and I'm not sure all of his explanations were all that disapproving. Much activist academic discourse views these issues, and indeed all issues around identity, in exactly this way. To do this, discourses of this kind must establish and specify the identities they wish to codify, valorize, and privilege or reduce. The production of the open infinite, gestured toward by Mill, structured by Hegel, and analyzed by Foucault, I would suggest works in precisely this way. It is a technology of production. Sexual freedoms of the kind sought by McCrae, specifically gay rights, required by those who identify as gay or lesbian, cannot, he seems to concede, be secured on the basis of the demos as a whole, but only by permission or repression of the demos, with the needs of some specified group within it in view. When that repression becomes impossible, then the reactionary drive of the electorate comes to the fore, and we regress, or so this argument implies. McCrae's observations about history having no side represent the impossibility of securing the sexual freedoms he desires on the basis of historical reason and its various forms. There is, I think he agrees, no necessary or a priori rational ground for the freedoms that he desires and outlines. These freedoms become, therefore, something like the specified drives of specific interest groups. Now, we could explore this also in a great more detail, but we must move on. If one can ground the sexual life of men and women neither in revealed religion, nor in an appeal to reason, nor in an appeal to historical reason, what I earlier called progressivism, nor in its corollary, a technology of human rights guaranteed in law, then how on earth are we to proceed? Let me ask this question slightly differently. Why does liberalism fail? Or rather, let me ask again, what is the genuine ground of the political itself? Liberalism is grounded in the partisan. It necessarily posits an educated or enlightened vanguard who advance the destiny of the rest of us. This necessity for the fences I referred to earlier is to hold in check those incapable for the vanguard and to protect those on it. However, McCrae has uncovered that there is no real goal to liberalism's progress. And by real, I mean actual or formal. It is at best what Foucault claims is the mere exercise of power, or what Nietzsche called a will to power. It is contestation in the name of some group who seeks to, and is capable to, occupy the vanguard position. Whatever Deneen, and in other words, I'm trying to suggest Hobbes is a bit closer at hand than we might think, or at least for McCrae. Whatever Deneen may think, this is no place in which to press the claims of a God. And this is the real reason I have a problem with religious conservatism and its influence on public policy. That if all one has is contestation, this is no place in which to press the claims of any God, even in the name of moral perfection, or failing that, mere moral hygiene of a polity. And so here is where I want to draw my own conclusions. For what we have witnessed in the last 2.5 centuries and the gradual unraveling of what was overlaid on Western life in the name of sexual morality, what we might call Christian morality, is important. It is not historical reason, but history itself that gives witness to this. And I've cut out a part of the paper for the sake of time, but I'm very happy to discuss it. It's worth discussing whether or not what Deneen names as religious conservatism is in fact a genuinely religious motive. My suggestion would be it isn't, and that what he attempts to reproduce as historic Christianity is largely, in fact, I would say, a product of the 19th century, but certainly a product of the Reformation. Something about the actual being of the human, it is not, therefore, historical reason, but history itself that gives us an important witness. Something about the actual being of the human being, the complexity of human life itself, has re-emerged in this unraveling of the hold of what we might call a Christian morality in the last 2.5 centuries. In fact, I want to go so far as to argue, in truth, this actuality of the human being never really went away. The preposterous claim that before the invention of the term homosexual, supposedly by Carl Maria Kertbeny around the year 1868, and a term that was later taken up by Krafft Ebing, that there were no homosexuals before 1868, belies a whole sexual history in the West, which is well documented from antiquity onwards. What we must take from this claim is that sexualized identity categories, homosexual, gay, lesbian, and all the others, are modern inventions, and indeed, I want to suggest, side effects or products of the technological management of modern sexual life. It's increasing medicalization as well, one might even say. But there is no reason to posit any of these categories as formal identities, a point exploited with some humor by Jonathan Katz in his book, The Invention of Heterosexuality. There is nothing particularly wrong with any of these categorizations, provided we accept that they are expressions of something rather more in the manner of a style, and not of any actual or formal identity. This is, if you like, a claim, you might say, that there is no such thing as a gay gene. In the name of preserving the moral character of sexual acts, Roger Scruton was oddly sniffy about the remarkable achievement of Alfred Kinsey, saying, and I quote him, "The true meaning of Kinseyism is to be found in this. It is the device whereby the sexual act is given back to objective nature and rid of its meaning." Now, this may be true of some of what was done with Kinsey's research, but not, despite the controversy over his methods and life, what Kinsey's research showed. Kinsey and his associates demonstrated that despite the strongly residual Christian conservatism of the United States of the 1940s and 1950s, men and women had sexual lives which were extraordinarily divergent from all that had hitherto been presumed. Many, a great many, ordinary red-blooded folk had complex sexual histories and interiority that was far from simple or monogamous, let alone heterosexual. I'm not advocating this, nor am I. I'm just simply saying this is what Kinsey showed. Now, the origins of Europe are suffused with both circumstantial and more formal accounts of the ubiquity of same-sex attraction and its proper place in human life, and not just in Greek antiquity. The ruminations of Kenneth Dober, Paul Vane, and Michel Foucault on same-sex life in antiquity are both revolting and often, despite in the first two cases some erudite scholarship, false, insupportably so, and often misconceived. But James Davidson's recent The Greeks and Greek Love is a far more serious and sympathetic account. And I could point you to a large body of entertaining graffiti from antiquity, which suggests the sheer ordinariness, suggestive of a very public acceptance of the expression of a very broad range of desires, which coincide with much that Kinsey's work pointed out. As this is, as it were, a family show, I won't do so. The fragments of Sappho, and not less the pages of Plato and Pindar and even Solon, and much in between, are filled with an intense same-sex eroticism and discussion of it, which rings with a joy and a freedom that I would suggest Scruton attempted to reach, even if at times what he said fell somewhat heavily off his pages. Other historical studies agree. Noel Malcolm's relatively recent Forbidden Desire in Early Modern Europe, together with his other work on the Ottoman period, have made this point. Then there is Michael Rock's work on Renaissance Florence. I could name many more similar studies. Numerous studies discuss non-European contexts, and then there is a multitude of rather entertaining websites twisting themselves to explain why there is nothing homoerotic in the work of several historic and hallowed Shia and Sunni poets. The actual historic record demonstrates that human sexual experience goes far beyond that envisaged by 19th century Christian moralists, and accepts same-sex and other sex experience is basic to human life in general. Now, this does not mean, and I'm not wanting to argue, it was the same for everyone. I'm simply saying it's there. Aristophanes' speech in Plato's Symposium makes no other point than this. Scruton is right to resist the rendering of the discussion of sexual life into a scientific discourse, a technology, even if he does not really get the drama of it all. I'm hugely sympathetic to McCrae's fears for the coming backlash, and I'm grimly miserable for the way in which human sexuality has become the business of a technological pedagogy of lawfare, regulation, and such things as consent classes and good lad projects. While there is much to commend in Deneen's attack on liberalism, there is frankly little to relish in where he points us to, and nothing intrinsically conservative in what he seems to offer of a return to a prudish and modernized sexual morality, which seems often to be nothing more than the idealization of a sweaty and a sweatiness dishonestly suggestive of a suburban 1950s life pursued in the name of Christian values. We should take our lead from Greek antiquity. Greek eroticism does not, in fact, it hardly ever focuses on the details of what goes on between the sheets. It regarded that as of concern alone to those involved. There's a real fence or private door for you. But it does concentrate on what is being unfolded as a public and so not private and therefore unfenced ecstasy for the souls of men and women in all our modes of combining. A rediscovery of a sexual life of this form would be, I would suggest, a genuinely conservative achievement. And so I will end on this point. What is it about democratic liberalism that must be overcome? Both McCrae and Deneen are partisan for what and whom they argue. McCrae wants a gay sexual rights revolution. Deneen wants Christian conservatism. The disaster of liberalism is that it is necessarily partisan, always led by a vanguard who hiss with privileged contempt at those they place at their rear. Identitarianism in all its forms is partisan and divisive. It reduces us to fighting for the claims of our respective identities within the state in what I have called an exercise of the will to power. The rejection of Christianity's or any other religion's sexual prohibitions as basic to public policy has already begun and must be allowed to open up a sense of emotional and moral freedom that need not be mere license, let alone licentiousness. Nor need it inhibit the life of any of those religions. Construing sexual life from specified identities is, I want to argue, incapable for taking a view of the whole of human life. The challenge for a genuine political philosophy, conservative or otherwise, is to overcome the divide between the people and the state. Still more seriously, to recognize that the word polis in Greek indicated both the people and the state, as well as the land and the city which contains us. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. And I think you raised enormous areas for us to discuss. And yes, I see that Aaron has his hand up, so let's go to Aaron.
Thank you very much, Laurence. You defined liberalism twice, and twice you called for a genuine inquiry into the ground of the political, or the essence of the political, but you didn't define conservatism once. And I wondered, in terms of pressing you for a definition, to what extent, in your view, would a consideration of conservatism and liberalism need to be held within a framework of an inquiry into the ground of the political? Are they necessary for inquiring into what the political is, or are they merely elements of the unfolding of the political out of Greece or out of history itself?
I mean, that's a really good question, and you've caught me out, because I mean, obviously, you know, I deftly avoided defining conservatism. I mean, my conservative hero is Solon. You know, Solon sets back into their proper places all the partisan groups within Athens. I mean, he's the opposite of Marxism. He recognizes that the rich are the problem, but he doesn't expropriate them. He cancels the debts that they've placed people into, but he doesn't punish them other than simply freeing their hands from the grip of their hands on the necks of everybody else. And that's hugely important because it seems to me that is a genuinely conservative impulse. He recognizes everybody for whom they are. I mean, that would fit, I would suggest, one of David McGrogan's definitions earlier. But I admit I'm using a very different conception of conservatism to the way most English or British conservatives would use it. And I'm cheekily smuggling in a lot of Greeks into my conservative horse in order to wheel it into Troy. And I haven't named what I think is the real ground of the polis, because I think that requires a separate consideration. But it must be logos itself. It must be not simply the word, but what both gathers the polis. Legein, after all, means gathering as well as speaking. But it is our capacity to address each other and how we address each other that must form the basis of political life. That is to say, I mean, that's where I think, well, I mean, there's an awful lot that you could say. I mean, the liberalism arises because the state as a force arises before democracy really becomes an issue for the states which allow it to happen. But nevertheless, states grudgingly concede democracy in place after place. That seems to me to be, you know, the unwritten subtext of both Hobbes and Rousseau, and it's the explicit subtext of Hegel in his attempt to take Rousseau on. And it's a conundrum because nobody wants to discuss it. It's what, for instance, people like Michael Dunn in Cambridge have wanted to do when they've said we shouldn't be talking about democracy because it doesn't exist. He has a point, but I still disagree with him because I think it is essential for us to discuss democracy because it's the question I kept asking when we discussed the question of tyranny. Is democracy what frees us from tyranny, or is tyranny what overtakes democracy, and is democracy what is more basic? That, to me, is the issue. And democracy is, for me, the ultimate conservative virtue, the securing and grounding of the polis on its own authority and in it for itself. But I mean, I could talk a lot longer, but I don't want to take up our time. But thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think, David, you have your hand up, so please ask.
Yeah. So this is directed more at the sort of the first half of the paper. I don't mean this to sound sort of snide or sniperish or whatever, but at the risk of being sort of one of those people, you didn't mention women very much in the discussion of sexuality, and it seems to me that a lot of the backlash against the sexual revolution, well, it's been driven by two different phenomena that sort of pertain to, I think, to sort of women's concerns, let's put it that way. One of them being that a lot of, I think, feminist authors would now make the case that the sexual revolution has been harmful to women's interests. And definitely people like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington have made this kind of a case. But it's also the case increasingly that women are rejecting the idea of relationships and marriage entirely, right? So an awful lot of young women nowadays would say they've got no interest in romantic relationships whatsoever, right? Not only are they not interested in getting married or having children, they're just not interested in men. And that's not because they're becoming lesbians, it's just because they don't want to have romantic relationships at all. So if there's going to be a backlash against the sexual revolution, I think it's going to come from that direction, which I don't think has anything to do with religious conservatism. If anything, it's the complete opposite of that. So I'm kind of throwing this out there because I haven't got an answer to that, to any of this, really. I don't have a sort of, a kind of ready-made way of explaining how that fits into everything that you were discussing. But I did wonder if you'd thought about that phenomenon, because if you're talking about kind of it's almost as that, economists talk about kind of revealed preferences. And it's almost as though now that we've stripped away, now that technology has kind of stripped away the necessity for there to be family life, because you can rely on, women can find employment, of course, but also they can rely on the state to support them if need be. The same is true of men, of course. It's almost as though it's a revealed preference that it turns out that a lot of women simply don't want to form families. So yeah, these are kind of thoughts that I'm just kind of throwing at you. But I'm wondering what you think about all of that.
I mean, I certainly don't take your comment as snide at all. And I did very carefully want to, I did insert into the paper a reference that I think women were facing particular problems. And that because I was addressing the issue of religious conservatism, and because I think, oddly enough, that has been driven by men and by very male concerns, it is to some extent to one side of the backlash that you're naming. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with any of the things that you've said. But McCrae discusses Louise Perry as well, and I think with some confusion. I mean, I don't mean. I mean, I think he's just startled by some of the things that she says. I mean, I also think that there is a strand of misogyny in much of the current emerging discourse. Especially in the so-called too far, that is screamingly alarming. I mean, and it's no accident that it was Kathleen Stock with whom I had that conversation, as it were. She is, after all, a victim, I think, of that misogyny to some extent. And I've been surprised at the way that has unfolded. But I do think that the battering ram that will be used is one of religious conservatism. I think it will be much more visible in the United States, but it will have an effect in the UK. And I'm at least, I would be wrong to say I'm concerned about it, but I am wary of it. What I really want to do is to use that as to use the questions that it raises, exactly as I did in the paper, as a pretext for opening up the question of what it means to talk about identities at all, because I think they are a trap. They've been a trap for women in exactly the ways that you've named. I think, for instance, the people like Louise Perry have rightly shown that. I mean, there is an argument among some feminists that women were seduced into the workplace and commodified as a result, and it's done many of them little good. And then there is another argument which is extremely important to make, which is that it is not true that there were not women in positions of power before the sexual revolution. There often were. I mean, there were a great number of women. For instance, I mean, I've argued in elsewhere that the 1944 Education Act in Britain was built on the back of the work of women who ran the board schools that actually educated working class kids who were then capable of passing the 11+ exam and getting into grammar schools. And the Spen report of, when was that, 1938, was predicated on that remarkable achievement, and that is a female achievement. All of those things, I think, are at work here. But I do think that there are inherent dangers in a religious backlash to the sexual revolution, and that's really, therefore, what I wanted to address. So no, I wasn't consciously leaving women. Well, I was consciously addressing McCrae's concerns and Deneen's concerns, and they are frankly driven by what is predominantly a male-oriented debate. But I would not in any way want to minimize the ways in which the questions for women also emerge here. I don't know if that answers your question.
So I take it you're sort of saying that it does answer your question, or would you like a moment to come back? Yes, do.
No, it wasn't really a question anyway. It was yes, it was a very adequate response, yeah, to what I said. Thank you.
Yes. So good. We've got time for last quick question from Thomas.
Yes. Thank you, John. Thank you, Laurence. It was extremely interesting and, to be frank, very refreshing to hear inside of conservative circles compared to what we usually hear, or at least what we've heard during the last 2 or 4 years. I have one small question about one moment where you mentioned that the one thing that is not working currently is that people don't get the time to adapt to the changes that have been done. And it's for this reason that our religious reaction is is seen as possible and is not seen as just a mirror of what would be a liberal way of relating to the state. So that claiming that the tradition can be enforced by the state. And I wonder, what are the conditions? What do you identify as the conditions that have changed for this not to happen? And if you'd like to do, I would also like you to comment a bit more when you say that the current problem of the situation mentioned by David is less a problem with women, but rather a problem with men. So if you can elaborate a bit, I would love to. Thank you.
Thomas, thank you so much for both those questions. I mean, to answer the first one, it wasn't accidental that I quoted the story Brokeback Mountain. Annie Proulx is a very clever and astute observer of the way that these questions unfold. And one of the key things in the story, which I think also came out in Ang Lee's film, is that what these two men who have fallen in love with each other fail to really understand, and what actually imprisons them in many ways, is that everybody around them knows what they're doing. Everybody. I mean, it's absolutely clear, especially to the women in the story. That, I think, is largely my own experience, and it's why I think identitarian arguments are a disaster. I mean, a friend of mine, for instance, was recently talking about going to Hungary, a gay friend of mine, and he said, you know, he was talking about what he perceives as the increased homophobia in Hungary. He said, when you arrive at the airport, there are posters about the family everywhere. And I think this is a very modern way that we look at the world. When a gay man sees a poster about a family, he automatically assumes that it excludes him, or it's there to provoke him, or to ostracize him in some way. And I said, well, surely these posters simply don't concern you. They don't matter to you. So in other words, they're not directed against you. Or as another Hungarian friend of mine who actually is, or an actual Hungarian friend of mine who knows the situation in Hungary and feels that many of the criticisms aimed at Orbán and Fidesz, even though he's not a supporter of Fidesz himself, are unfair, has pointed out. He said, what the hell are people in the West doing when they claim that Orbán is homophobic? Budapest is the capital of the gay subculture in Eastern Europe. And he has a point. He's not the only person to be making that point. In other words, there is a way in which we all play a game when we enter into these partisan reading of the questions. My argument was simply to destabilize this question of seeing this idea of seeing it through the lens of partisan identities. Now, that is predicated on one important thing. It is only the production of those identities that has won us the freedoms that we now want to secure. And therefore, it would be wrong to say that the production of those identities has no place whatsoever. But maybe I might suggest it is time for us to abandon those identities as simply explaining the sexual life that we have. In other words, we have to take history seriously. We have to take even the recent history of how these questions have unfolded very seriously. On your second question, can you just remind me, would you mind, sorry, because my brain is fogged, I'm old and tired.
Yes.
And just ask everybody if we can be quite brief, because I should bring things, I feel responsibility to bring things to an end reasonably quickly after 4 o'clock. So just briefly, Thomas, and then
yes, very briefly, it was about when David mentioned the fact that less and less people, less and less women want to be in a relation. You said, and I think I agree, that it is not a problem with women and that we have to locate in feminism, or at least feminism talking, or liberalism addressed to women, but a problem with men.
I think I agree with you on that. And I also, I do think that this is where state policy does matter, that state policy actually has to become far more supportive of family life, taxation structures, and so forth. need to start addressing these issues, which they haven't. And that, after 14 years of Conservative government in Britain, where the Conservative Party did almost nothing in that area, I think a Conservative philosophy that asked Conservatives to address those issues is long overdue, would be my suggestion.
Well, thank you. I mean, perhaps that seems a very good place to end. And indeed, I think that there's something really important for us and fascinating in a paper which, on the one hand, came to the conclusions it did, but also you're ending your answer to the questions with that remark. And of course, they're not at all incompatible; they fit together. And I think we need to see how and think how they fit together. But I think both papers were enormously rich, and we've had a very good discussion. But that, of course, hasn't started to do justice to either of the papers. So, thank you very much, everybody, for speaking and asking questions and coming along. And I must say I'm excited about the idea of these seminars, and we won't have anything now until the new year, because we're getting towards the end of term and Christmas time. But we are planning one in which we hope to get together, if we can get the right dates. Thomas Scherer, who was just asking a question, and also another Thomas, Tom Pink, who couldn't be here today but is interested to talk. So the date has not yet been decided for that, but that's something for us all to look forward to. So may I thank you all again, and special thanks to Aaron for introducing everything, as well as for the questions, and of course to Laurence, both as speaker and as director of the whole show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, John. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.